her very first memory of dad was him coming up to her bedroom, screaming at her to shut up, and firing his pistol into her mattress, scaring her and scarring her then for the rest of her life. We're not trying to do for somebody. We're trying to walk with and do with somebody. And when we do that, something really special happens. Each of us has a barrier that really needs to be looked at. But this is what I would end with. I think a great leader in today's day and age must take on the work of becoming a social leader. All of those companies have baked the social aspect, that corporate social responsibility, deeply into their business model. And not only is it the right thing to do, or maybe the moral thing to do, the charitable thing to do, but you go and look at the data and it's the stronger economic thing to do. Sure. Thanks, Randy. Thank you for inviting me on the call this morning and your podcast. And thank you all for being willing to show up. Randy told me I got to send you all $20 for your time, each of you. So, but I appreciate it. You know, Reconciliation Services is a more interesting story than mine, but I'll give you my quick history and then we can jump into the important stuff. I grew up here in Kansas City. I grew up in Prairie Village and Overland Park. I'm, you know, kind of a Kansas City native. My family's been here a really long time. And I went to SMU in Dallas for a year until I realized that that was not the school for me. I dropped out. And I was actually in the Christian music industry for a while. In the 90s, I was a singer-songwriter and got signed and toured around for a little bit, sort of a has-been who never was. And I ended up going back to school at Belmont University, and I have a business degree and an audio engineering emphasis. And so again, I sort of thought that I was going to spend time doing music and art, which is really my love, sort of that intense creativity and entrepreneurship. But I ended up getting out of school and going to work for the Nashville Rescue Mission for about $2 an hour back in 2000. And when I was there, I thought it was going to be a stopover, but I met this guy named Clay Huddleston, who was a retired Fortune 500 CFO out of Memphis who had moved up to Nashville in his retirement. And I just had the most wonderful relationship with him. And he really saw something in me that I didn't see. He took me under wing and I began this journey to learn about nonprofits and the intersectionality between business, faith, and philanthropy. And it just really caught my heart. And what I had loved in the artistic world was the way that those things all came together for me. And then when I realized that I could do that for a living and have spent time both in the for-profit world in consulting and sales and marketing and entrepreneurship, as well as most of my professional career in the nonprofit world. But I've always sort of been an entrepreneur. I'm always starting something. So that's a little bit of my history. My wife and I moved back here to Kansas City in 2008. I'm an Orthodox Christian priest. I went and got a master's in divinity later in my 30s. And so those of you who might not know the Orthodox Christian tradition, it's sort of like Catholic, but I'm married and I've got 3 teenage boys. So they keep me pretty busy. Reconciliation Services really was I volunteered here starting in 2008, and the founder and his wife, Father Alexei Alshol, and his wife Thelma, or Mother Michaela is how I knew her. Thelma and Father were really inspirational, and their story actually is coming out today in the Social Leader podcast, which will be dropping at some point in time today on our YouTube channel and Facebook, etc., for Reconciliation Services. And he really goes into depth there. But the short version of the story is that Father Alexei, at the time David, was a 3-piece suit financial services guy, lived in Leawood, and in 1984, he came down to Linwood and Troost, and he met a number of people, including later his wife, Thelma, that really changed his heart and changed his mind about how to love our neighbors. And slowly over time, he began to move down here. Eventually, Thelma and Father Alexi, again at the time David, ended up getting married, and they were just complete opposites. She was an African-American woman from Texarkana, Arkansas, who grew up on the segregated side of that town. She was 5 foot tall, but just loving and energetic and really a powerhouse the way I knew her. And Father Alexi was, 6'2" or something, and white and from Leawood. But the two of them, having come through different things in their lives, met at a period of time where there was great need here on Troost, and they, by God's providence, ended up falling in love. And they started something called Reconciliation Ministries. Eventually, they bought this building that I'm sitting in at 31st and Troost. And then over time, that became two different things. It became a church called St. Mary of Egypt Orthodox Christian Church. And St. Mary, who was from Egypt, she was a third century sex addict and prostitute who eventually became an Orthodox Christian. And then Reconciliation Services was the other thing that was formed. So from that common root, you have a faith community that's formed independently, though, of a public benefit charity. So when I got here in 2008, my wife and I were volunteers. My oldest is 18 now, and so we had our kids in Maya wraps on the back, and we were just coming down here to volunteer. Eventually, we got involved with the faith community, and I became a volunteer second priest with Father Alexi, and just really began to learn from a man who had gone through so much in his life and had done a lot of deep heart work as a leader, as a man, as a Christian, and really did a lot of work on his own stereotypes and the racial stereotypes that he'd been raised with in his family and kind of in the dominant culture around us. So I just was fascinated by his journey. So after a while in 2012, unfortunately, his wife Thelma passed away in March 2012, and he went on a sabbatical. And during that time, he asked me whether or not I would, fill in for him, both at the church as well as Reconciliation Services. So my wife and I prayed about that. And in 2013, we moved from Overland Park down east of Troost on Forest Avenue and about 36th Street. And we bought a house. And I'll tell you, when we did that, my family, let's just say they defecated masonry. If you get my drift, they they were really worried about me moving over here because there are a lot of stereotypes, but there is also the reality of violence. But more than that, there's the fear and the perception of Kansas City of what happens on Troost and east of Troost. And although that's changing, 8 years or more ago, that was a pretty big deal. So when we moved here, eventually, Father Alexi became a monastic after his wife had passed away. He dedicated his life to prayer and to service. And I became the priest of the church and the executive director of Reconciliation Services. Our mission is to cultivate a community in Kansas City that's seeking racial and economic reconciliation one heart at a time. Our goal is to transform Troost Avenue from a dividing line into a gathering place and really to reveal the strength of all. And at one point in time, we were thinking very specifically over the course of our 30 years as an organization in one form or another, we were thinking very specifically about Troost as a street. But, the line of Troost and the amount of development, and we could talk about gentrification if you want to, the positives and the negatives there, but the line of development has really shifted, and there's hundreds of millions of dollars of investment that's happening on Troost now. And so, to be honest, what's apparent now is that Troost is not just a street in our city that divides us, but it's really a line of division in each of our hearts. We all have somebody who lives on the other side of that Troost. And so the larger meta of what we're trying to do is to really break down those barriers and those walls that keep racial and economic segregation in place in Kansas City. I don't know if you all know, but we are, according to one recent study, the 5th most segregated city in the United States, racially and economically. And if you look at the census map or a dot map, you can really see that, where you see where white folk live and where black folks live and where the money goes. So our work, finally, I'll leave you with this, and then Randy, you go wherever you want to go. But our work kind of falls into three buckets. We are a social venture, which means that we are striving as a nonprofit organization to bring together the best of business best practices, both in the way that we innovate, the way that we manage, the way that we operate in the city. So the best of business, the best of faith, meaning that business is an amoral thing. To me, it needs moral men and women to push the market in moral directions. And faith, not just mine, but other faiths, do a really great job of putting the bumpers on business and kind of making sure that we do the best that we can to maintain and to value the personhood of those that we work with, those that we buy from, and those that we sell to. And then philanthropy, bringing together the best of philanthropy also. And I'll lump in the public sector, the government sector in with philanthropy for reasons that we could talk about in another meeting. But like, to me, there's the need for philanthropy to bring first dollar or last dollar into a project in order to incentivize priorities that wouldn't otherwise return an ROI. So Reconciliation Services is bringing those three things together. We serve about 5,000 people or more. I think it was 5,300 people last year, individuals with social and trauma therapy services, with economic community building services, and then really working on community revitalization and breaking down the drastic loneliness and isolation that still exists on the East Side. So a lot of different programs fall under that theory of change, but I think I've fire hosed everybody enough. So Randy, I'll give it back to you, and maybe you want to go one direction or another.
Yeah, if you have questions, type them in the chat and we'll unmute you. I guess a couple that come to mind for those that don't know, maybe just tell us a bit about what you do with Thelma's Kitchen and a couple of the other works, what goes on there.
Yeah, so, in my experience 25 years ago at the rescue mission, that model, I not so lovingly refer to it as sort of soup soap salvation. That model from the 1950s of feeding people from behind a counter does a really good job of meeting today's hunger, but doesn't do much at all to address tomorrow's hunger. And it also serves to reinforce both economic and racial barriers. Just honestly, most of the time when you go to those kinds of works, which are good works, the problem is that you have mostly people of privilege, white folks on one side, and by and large, and then you have, by and large, at least in this city here, you have people of color on the other side. And that has to do with the structural racism, the fact where poverty is in Kansas City and how we got here. So what I was looking to do was to figure out, okay, how are we going to build community? How are we going to bake equity and diversity into the model in such a way that it doesn't continue to unwittingly reinforce these stereotypes? And how are we going to do more to bake equity and diversity and inclusion into the cake and not just put charity sprinkles on the top? So we began to do a listening program for about a year with our neighbors. And what they told us was, look, we feel over social serviced. Sure, we need help, but look, this is our community and we want affordable retail. We don't just want things that are there to, to help. We have strength waiting to be revealed. So we began to think about how could we address healthy food and the food access issues that are present here in this 10 zip codes directly around 31st and Troost. Look, one out of 8 of our neighbors here is very food insecure, meaning they don't know where they're going to get their next meal, especially if the school's not open. So there was a present need to address food insecurity, but we also needed to build community. And if our guiding framework is reconciliation, racial and economic reconciliation, we can't do that with only one side of the community at the table. We can't serve, our clients are 76% African-American and 99% of our neighbors live below the federal poverty line. If that's the only group we're gathering together, we might do a decent job of addressing the most extreme disparities in our community, but we're not going to get at the root issue that we really want to grapple with that causes or has caused, continues to perpetuate those disparities. We've got to bring the other side of the community, the white, the wealthy, and other sides of the community together. And so, and Reconciliation Services and listening to our community began to realize, okay, we have an opportunity right now based on what's happening economically on Troost. We can bring together both of those communities in one space, and through breaking bread together, we can actually build relationship. So Thelma's Kitchen was launched. We're Kansas City's first donate what you can restaurant. And then in light of COVID, we also, this was already a plan, but we also launched something just on Monday called Thelma's Box Lunch. You can go to thelmasboxlunch.org. And it's a very high quality box lunch that is available for purchase online. That's an earned income revenue strategy to support all the rest of our work that we do. But then if you walk up here to 31st and Troost to our to-go window, you get the exact same product, the exact same scratch kitchen, incredible lunch, but we are giving that away to those who need it the most. We have these tokens that are like gift cards that our partners and our social workers give to those who we work with, so that we know that we're targeting the free or the sponsored food where it's needed the most. But then you can also donate what you can. So there's a minimum of $3, which is roughly our food cost. And what we're wanting is radical participation. We want people to participate in revealing their own strength. So we're not trying to, you probably heard this idea, we're not trying to do for somebody, we're trying to walk with and do with somebody. And when we do that, something really special happens. The individual feels dignified in an authentic and in a profound way, but we also have the opportunity to learn and grow ourselves. So Thelma's Kitchen is a big part of what we do. You know, you all are in the business world. It's kind of like our big click funnel. You know, it's how people get to know us now. But the real work is not just Thelma's Kitchen. It happens in our trauma therapy program and in the rest of our work. So that trauma therapy program is evidence-based, clinical, but we call it a stealth mental health program because people don't realize that they're getting that clinical and evidence-based intervention. They just know they're in a relationship, they're in a group, they're seeing a counselor who is helping them move forward, and they're getting that sponsored by donors and for free to them. So Randy, that's a bit of our work. There's a chat. Drew says, do what's right when nobody's watching. How do you think we need to open up a narrative of understanding in a positive way that's constructive in our community, in our nation? You know, the first thing is I would say, Drew, that we need to acknowledge what has happened and what is happening. A lot of healing takes place by just simply saying, this happened. Think about any time somebody has offended you and then didn't say anything about it. And maybe 2 years later, they come back and they say, hey, Drew, you know, back when I really, really did wrong. And I just want to say, I'm sorry. You know, that might not go to healing the actual ramifications of the wrong, but it goes a long way in actually beginning a relationship again and repairing that relationship. So Drew, I think we need to begin positively and constructively in our community and in our nation by acknowledging what has happened. And we typically don't want to do that because it's painful. We want to skip right to, let me fix something. I've been married almost 22 years. I regularly don't want to say I'm sorry. I just say, let me fix that, right? But the reality is she doesn't want me to fix it. She wants me to say, I realize that I did this and I'm sorry. And then we work on fixing. So that's what I would suggest as a starting point.
Are there any success stories that come to mind, you know, either just of business partnerships that you've seen help transform lives, or where the work that you did through Reconciliation Services, you've seen that really have an impact on somebody's trajectory in their life?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, every day, people who are struggling to survive and succeed come into Reconciliation Services, and especially right now during COVID. Look, people who had minimum wage jobs or who had $9, $10 an hour jobs in the service industry, those are gone by and large. People who were barely able to make their rent now aren't making their rent, and the eviction rate is skyrocketing. The moratorium on utilities and not paying those has passed. And so that is difficult for landlords and businesses, but it is even equally or more difficult for those who are barely making it to begin with. So people come to us every day and they need simple things that we take for granted. Most of us in our wallet and or in our purse have this little piece of plastic that we call an ID, right? And they whip out that driver's license or that ID, and they're able to get access to things like apply for a job or get housing or enroll your kid in school right now. You got to have that ID and that birth certificate to really get moving forward. So a lot of times people will come for a meal in Thelma's Kitchen. They'll learn about what we do. They'll make friends, they'll feel comfortable with us. We lower those barriers to entry and we increase that sense of dignity. And then usually we're working on something like a utility bill or an ID or getting rent and utilities so that their family can just live another couple of months and figure things out. When we build a relationship in Thelma's Kitchen, then we earn the privilege of stepping into a crisis with a friend and really earning trust, really being there when somebody needed it. Then once we do those first two steps, we're then afforded the opportunity through that relationship and through that trust to get to the deeper heart matters, if they exist, where we can talk about counseling and therapy and healing. So, there was a woman named Cassandra who came in just like that. She came in for a meal. She needed help with an ID. She had been raised in a horrible home. Her first memory, Cassandra's first memory of her daddy, she said, was when she was 5 years old and there was some kind of event going on downstairs. Her parents were having a good time and she was scared and crying in her bed and she'd been told to go to sleep. And rather than her father consoling her, her very first memory of dad was him coming up to her bedroom, screaming at her to shut up, and firing his pistol into her mattress, scaring her and scarring her then for the rest of her life. So I can't imagine the way that trauma rippled its way through the rest of her life. But she had a string of really bad traumatic relationships. She did get addicted to drugs, trying to cope with the pain and the trauma that she felt. She was incarcerated for a while. She just never made it past that moment. And sure, people have personal responsibility for certain things in their life, but I think we all know that there are certain events in our life that really shape who we are and limit our feeling of what choices that we have, if not limit the actual choices that we have. So Cassandra came to us after that long life. She was probably in her mid-50s. And when I met her, she came in for food and for an ID. We were able to get her enrolled into our Reveal trauma therapy program after getting her basics, her ID and other things. And she began over the first 90 days to find real healing for the first time from the PTSD, that traumatic event. And when that happens, that level of hypervigilance goes down. That level of toxic stress goes down. You can begin to think right again, or maybe for the first time. And Cassandra got on her feet. She's been able to hold down a job. She's been able to keep stable housing. We needed to walk with her for quite a while, but now she's really doing well and on her own. So Cassandra still comes back around to Thelma's Kitchen, but there are thousands of Cassandras, men and women and their children, who we're helping every single day at Reconciliation Services. But it's not possible without the partnerships that we have with men and women in business and with the foundation community and with individuals who volunteer and contribute.
Thank you for all you're doing, and I look forward to learning more about RS. I have been to Thelma's personally a few times. I even took my little girl down there and we had lunch and sat with some people from the community. And the thing I love most about what you're doing, and you mentioned it earlier, is I just truly believe that if people of resources get to know people without resources, we can solve a lot of our own problems. And your way of going about it is one way that I think that can happen. And a matter of fact, I think it might be the best way in Kansas City. So thank you for all you're doing.
Hey, thank you for the comment. I mean, I would be remiss if I didn't say that, um, like they say, it takes a village. You know, there are certain problems that are so large and so systemic that we as a city have to come together through mechanisms like taxation in order to solve things. Like, for example, some of the most drastic mental health work that's needed is so big that no foundation or philanthropist could possibly fund it and sustain it over the long term. It's going to take all of us to do that. So, for example, Jackson County Mental Health Levy, which is a tax, is part of fueling how we do that work. But the long-term situation, aside from kind of government and the politics, is we have to have our hearts shifted. We have to do the hard heart work that builds empathy, builds trust, and we have to be willing to come in with cultural humility, not having all the answers. The one thing that I didn't believe 22 years ago, but that I strongly believe now, is that the answers and the solutions actually already are in the community. And one of the problems that we have, particularly, I'm going to speak as white guys in business, is that we've been successful and we know how to run things, men and women, and we come into communities and think like, hey, I can solve that. Let me do this. Let me do that. But remember the story of Thelma's Kitchen. We would not have come up with that if it weren't for listening to the community and them saying, we feel social serviced and we're ready to feel included. And so they really gave that introduction. So I say that because we're in a political season, and I don't want to talk about where you vote, but I do want to talk about trying to, on each side of the aisle, stretch ourselves to have crucial conversations and stretch ourselves to take a little bit of a walk down the path of empathy and dialogue, because we are so polarized right now. But you don't get a Thelma's Kitchen by drawing a hard line. It's a nuanced conversation, and it's going to take nuanced and creative solutions in order for individuals and groups and communities to solve these really tangled problems that we've got.
Well, thank you for sharing your story. It sounds like a really, really good program and a good model. One of the things you talked about is them feeling social serviced, and the traditional model of just, I'm handing this to you and you're taking it, doesn't work. So have there been things you've done from a mentorship standpoint? Have there been natural mentorships that have evolved through the groups of people that are volunteers, people that are being served to help them with the next stage in their life? For example, finding jobs. And I know it's not as easy as just finding jobs. There's a lot of things that go towards that, of getting the skills to be able to find jobs. Have you done those kinds of programs, or there been anything like that that's naturally evolved between the communities you serve and the volunteers?
Yeah, that's a great question, Michelle. Thank you. So we have a theory of change. Remember that reconciliation services, we're predicated on this idea that if we're going to solve the root problem, then we have to bring both sides together. So we offer education and meaningful opportunities for engagement to both our, what we call our client guests, which are folks that need services, they need help in some tangible way, and then our partner guests, which are people that may be rich, may be poor, may be on the east or the west side of truce, but they don't need our services. So our goal is to offer meaningful engagement, opportunities to increase the well-being measured on 11 different points for each of those communities, and then to offer education and make the connection between poverty and trauma. So for a client, until they begin to address not only the structural barriers like the need for ID, the need for adequate housing, et cetera, they're not going to be able to get to the deep heart work that needs to be done. But when you do get to that spot, you're in a safe enough place that you can work on the trauma that's there. And by the way, 92% of all people in the United States who are in a healthcare service provision organization receiving services, 92% of them have had a traumatic event in their life that they're dealing with. So it really is kind of ubiquitous across the spectrum, depending on whatever silo you're working in socially. Once you get to the point where you can work on that trauma, Now there's an opportunity for them to discern how to move forward with their strengths. So it's not a one-on-one like big brother, big sister mentoring program. I mean, there are good programs that do that. And I have a radical aversion to duplication and waste of resources. There is not a scarcity, but there's a need for collaboration, coordination, and working together. So we're not doing one-on-one mentoring. There's a lot of people that do that. But what we are doing is bringing together peers in our group therapy, peers in Thelma's Kitchen, and then building relationships that can become on their own helpful relationships that help somebody move forward. The last thing I would say is that people who live in isolated or concentrated poverty, they have a lot of social capital. There are a lot of people who get what they're going through and can commiserate. What folks who are in concentrated poverty and trauma don't have abundance of is what we call bridging capital. So I can commiserate with you, but neither of us can get us out of here. So think about the last time you applied for a job. You knew somebody who knew somebody over there who got you an interview. That's 99% of how people get jobs or move forward. So what Thelma's Kitchen and Reconciliation Services does a really good job of is getting people to a place where they have revealed their own strengths and they're able then to contemplate where they can find that bridging capital and take the next step. On the partner guest side, we're offering that really direct orientation and education so that we can make more informed decisions about how we use the time and the life that we've got as social leaders to have greater social impact. So we're launching something called the Social Leader Essentials e-course, which is launching in the next 2 weeks. And that's going to be available online. You'll go to thesocialleader.org, which you can do today, and sign up to be the first to know when that's coming out. But it's an incredible education opportunity to mentor our partner guests and to offer some of the same education that we offer our client guests so that all ships can rise together.
Thank you, Randy. Hi, Father. My name's Maddie. I'm always interested in, especially with community building, how you get people involved and what holds people back from getting involved. And so I was just curious, what do you find is the tipping point for getting people to actually walk through the door?
So that's a good question. I appreciate it because it's an important one. You know, how do you mobilize and engage people when they come to a place where they want to help? I think the first thing that we have to do is look at the individual barriers that we have. A lot of us have conscious or unconscious bias that sort of says, well, I am or am not going to be able to help. A lot of us, let's be frank, we look at somebody who's in need and for whatever reason, we begin to think, well, they're lazy, they're addicted, they're this, they're that. We often don't look first at the issue and say, okay, not what's wrong with them, but what happened to them. And when we begin to ask the question, what happened to them that they would make those choices or that they're in those situations, we begin to build empathy and we begin to listen to the lived experience of those around us. Now, by the way, this could be, you know, work in the social service world or in the world that I live in on the east side of Troost, working with folks who are struggling to survive or succeed, or it could be a business owner or a leader or somebody who's leading a team in a company who have employees who are struggling with mental health. They are struggling with depression. They are going through traumatic events. And when we begin to change our leadership paradigm and embrace that idea of what I call social leadership, you can begin to open up pathways for entering into solving and bringing solutions to problems that are they're holistic. So really, Maddie, for every person, it's a little bit different. For some folks, they're scared of 31st and Troost, and they don't want to come down here because they think, you know, they need a gun. They think it's dangerous. And for other people, it's, you know, thinking, look, I don't want to put my time into those people because they've made their bed, they're going to lie in it. For others, it's just, man, I'm too busy, or man, I don't have enough money. Each of us has a barrier that really needs to be looked at. But this is what I would end with. I think a great leader in today's day and age must take on the work of becoming a social leader. If you look at the greatest companies that are out there right now, and I'm talking to a group of business folks, look at Tom's Shoes, look at Patagonia, look at Newman's salad dressing, right? All of those companies have baked the social aspect, that corporate social responsibility, deeply into their business model. And not only is it the right thing to do, or maybe the moral thing to do, the charitable thing to do, but you go and look at the data and it's the stronger economic thing to do. I believe that the relationship, the social contract between employees and customers and consumers and leaders has permanently shifted. And the companies that do not begin to look at corporate social responsibility and social return on investment as key to their business, whether they're an IT company or they're Cerner or they're a nonprofit, if we don't start looking at that, those companies that don't do that are going to quickly find themselves irrelevant. First of all, in terms of talent retention and hiring, because Gen Xers and millennials are looking to work for folks where they feel like they're a part of something bigger than the product or the service that they're delivering. But also because the community wants to support and purchase from companies and from teams that have prioritized their social priorities as well. We now see the power of being able to harness our dollar to be able to do more than just buy something for ourselves. So I think I've gotten off track on your question, but I think that we have to begin the journey as leaders, especially in the business community, of becoming social leaders. And those leaders are the most creative, the most entrepreneurial, and the most important leaders of our time, because they're striving to lead with greater social impact.
You've got to pause for applause, because I'm fired up with the, I passionately believe in a lot of what you're talking about. Yeah, Adam's
snapping.
finger snaps. Yeah, but I've seen that in action. I know that what you're talking about is true, and so you've got me fired up.
Cool.
I'm going to unmute Frank.
Morning, Father. I love the topic, near and dear to my heart. I've been volunteering for the homeless for many years, and you really struck a chord with me when you talked about how people look at the homeless or somebody on the corner asking for $1 or $2 or $3 for some lunch, look at them and speak about them as if they want to be there or they deserve to be there. The question I have for you is, I would like to see for all of us to get to a point where it's not an issue of race, white, people of color, black, white, black, brown, whatever. This is an issue of humanity. And I would love to remove those racial, I think that sometimes can go a long way to separate us. It's about humanity. It's not about one against the other or one has more than the other. Because I will tell you, I'm in the career management business. I get calls from people daily, 10 to 15 a day, of people that from the outside, it looks like they've got it pretty good. Well, I'll tell you, Father, they don't. Suffering's kind of a relative thing, right? So there's a lot of suffering going on across the board. So how might you suggest that we focus more on the humanity of what's going on versus color of skin?
Yeah, so, Frank, we're going to need a number of beers to unpack that question. So
I'd love that.
Okay, well, you come on down. But look, I'm going to give you an answer that I don't know if you're going to like, but I'd encourage you to have more conversations with me, because of our love of humanity, we have to look at each of the areas of our society and really get honest about how did somebody get there. And we can't make these wide sweeping statements that, nobody in this community suffers and this community has all the suffering. Absolutely. Everyone suffers from every different race, creed, religion, gender. I mean, I think about my wife and the the level of like gender bias there is in the workplace, and what, you know, what she's even endured. She was a reporter, and the junk that she had to endure when we lived in Nashville as a woman in a kind of old school reporter context. But the thing is that there are structural inequities, and those structural inequities, just look at the data, look at the math. They do follow racial lines. Now, we have to ask ourselves, why is that the case? Now, some people go to the extreme and they would say, well, it's because this culture or this people group is inferior to another people group. That is like classic, you know, racism in that sense. That's how we got slavery to begin with, for example, this idea that there's sort of chattel law. But at the same time, we have to kind of move beyond that stark argument, and we have to look at the nuance. And I think you as a business leader, Frank, have probably the ability to look at complex problems, see the nuance, and look and kind of get into the weeds on the data. So if we look at Kansas City, for example, the 76% of the people that we serve in the 10 zip codes living on the east side of Troost are Black. 99% of our neighbors live below the federal poverty line. That means a family of 4 living on $25,000 or less. The reality of the level of concentrated suffering in that community on the east side of Troost is not comparable, like per capita, to the number of people suffering in the community that I grew up in as a white man. That doesn't mean there wasn't pain, there wasn't suffering. Certainly there was in my own life and in the lives of people that I know, small business owners. But what we have to look at is the way that the community on the east side got there. Because nobody wakes up, you worked at the homeless shelter, nobody wakes up and goes, hey, I think I'm gonna be a crack addict and go live at the rescue mission today. Right. There's a series of circumstances, a series of decisions that are made that get somebody to that point. Not all of them, I know, because you worked down there, not all of them are personal decisions. Some of them are thrust upon individuals. So a lot of our neighbors don't start at 0 and then move on up the ladder from there. They start at -4, have to get to 0, and then move up. Some can, some can't. People like Cassandra, who I talked about earlier, certainly has every ability to move up the ladder, but she had to overcome a lot more than some other people. And she had the disadvantage of gender, the disadvantage of the color of her skin that also held her back in other areas, in addition to the education that she received. Now, the east side of Troost didn't just wake up Black and poor. It was engineered that way by my grandfather's generation, our parents' generation, in order to address the desire for our kids not to go to school together after Brown v. Board, you know, all of these other factors. Everybody's listening to KCUR. So, you know, while I agree with you that we need to talk about humanity, we need to get to a place where we really are struggling to help everybody societally. What we can do, though, is recognize that when one part of our body is hurting more than the rest, we usually begin with addressing that. And when we begin to address the structural racial inequity and the economic inequity that is absolutely mathematically present, and I could show you the data, not opinion, not religion, just the economic data. When we begin to address that, not only are we being moral and we're being more humane and we're addressing humanity, but we're also providing a superior economic growth for the region. That is a superior economic growth model for the region. So all ships can rise together. It's really complicated because the polarization right now in our society around the words Black Lives Matter, all lives matter, this sort of thing, again, that's why I said we need to have a couple beverages to unpack it, because I can give you my perspective, having worked for 22 years here, and race is a major part of it. Education is a major part, trauma is a major part, but believe me or don't believe me, and I don't know if I'll be able to convince you, but the reality is the race is a big part of it. And the history of how we got here is understanding that, recognizing that, wrestling with that, is a part of how we're going to be able to move forward. So we have to do that. We need to have a little bit of what's been done in other countries, in my opinion. Like if you go to countries like Germany, who was ripped by Nazi Germany and the anti-Semitism with the Jewish community and the Holocaust, they took very specific steps as a nation to address the past atrocities so that they could lay a firm foundation in order to move forward. We have not done that in the same way, I would argue, nationally. South Africa, after apartheid, had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. We have not done that as a nation. So people agree or disagree with me. You're asking me my thoughts on how we move forward. We have to acknowledge that as a foundation. Then from there, we can rebuild. And some of those things can happen at the same time.
Thank you again.
Yeah, thanks, Frank. Tough question.
When I ran my last company, I knew through personal experience that the community involvement initiatives and the charity team initiatives that we were involved in were huge factors on recruiting and retaining people. I had a lot of people come in and say, I stay here because what we do makes a difference. And right. I got a job that offered me more money, but I want to be here because what we do makes a difference. So from personal experience, I knew that those were critical, not just as right things to do to set a culture and create a tone for an organization, but they mattered to people when your own people were out recruiting people to come join the team. But there are a lot of business leaders, and I use that term loosely, that are skeptics and are numbers hogs and are data hogs, and they want to know, what does this do for me for making the quarter? What does this do for me for helping meet shareholder expectations? And even if there are well-intentioned people in their organization, they may bump into a wall of trying to convince them that this social leadership actually is a critical part of being a successful organization. Have you been able to map out or model anything that would help someone go make that case in their organization that, hey, this is good for us?
Yeah, again, the Social Leader Essentials program that's getting ready to launch, thesocialleader.org, you can find out more. The first of 3 modules, the first module addresses what I call the social venturing mindset. And I lay out really clearly the case for how embracing the social venturing mindset actually increases productivity, it increases creativity, and it leads to product innovation. So if we're taking an extremely short-term view of our quarter and not looking, if we're looking at balancing a balance sheet because we're in crisis, sure, just like a family that's not sure where it's going to live next month, you got to deal with today. You need to make payroll. I get that. When you get to a place where you're now looking at the strategic vision for your organization moving forward, I think you do the organization and future quarters a disservice by not doing everything that you can to make sure that your teams are as functional, creative, and conflict-free as possible. The data shows that by rooting out and addressing unconscious bias in our teams, we reduce conflict. When we reduce conflict, we increase productivity. Let me give an example. So companies started out by making assistive solutions for the deaf and for the blind. Those solutions at the first were relegated to a particular sort of medical need or a special needs community. But those same solutions were then adapted into like Siri and OK Google that we now have, my phone just went off, that we now have on all of our cell phones, right? So by bringing in more information into the product design space and by really taking a human-centered design thinking modality in your company, you're going to bring in other data that will initially be to address biases that are latent within the company or the culture. But by the end of the road, you can prove over time that data that gets brought into the process creates a superior product, a superior culture, which leads to greater profitability, both for the company and for the region. That is my strong belief from the data. you know, I'd probably need a PhD to write the white paper on it. I don't have that, but that's my experience. And I think you can look at other companies and other best practices to see that. We're stuck as a culture right now. I think there's a dichotomy between, you know, short-term thinking and long-term thinking. And the further we can move our thinking out once we're not in crisis into midterm and long-term thinking, the better products, the better teams, the better companies, the better communities that we're going to be able to forge together.
I think one question I have heard through the grapevine that you are working, speaking of some of those long-term solutions, on ways to, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, so please clarify for me, but ways to recruit businesses to the Truist Corridor. If it's too early to talk about that, that's fine, but I am curious about your thoughts on some of those things.
Yeah. So the business recruitment itself is not a large direct strategy, but it is a byproduct of other strategies. So for example, we have a program called Lunch on Me KC, and I'm trying to recruit companies to come down and participate in Thelma's Kitchen box lunch by helping us to pack those box lunches. And then I do like a 45 to 60-minute Zoom orientation and Q&A. And the company can ask me to talk about whether we want to talk about bias or diversity or the 200-year history of Truist. So I'm trying to combine sort of an HR DE&I training with a volunteer team building project with doing social good as a community, in the community as a company. And so we're recruiting companies to come down. By doing that, they also are sponsoring our work. It's $1,200 to come and do that. It's chock full of value. But the more companies I get down here, the more we fuel our work. And I believe the more we further their understanding of Truist and kind of the reality of how the business community can participate in the healing process and moving the community forward. I'm also working with another board of reconciliation services, the RS Social Ventures Board, to launch a 3PL contract packaging company, which will engage businesses and community. I have to capitalize that project first. So Harvard Business Journal says that 9 out of 10 companies fail for undercapitalization. So if anybody wants to invest in that, I'd love to talk with you. But we're going to get that company off the ground to create living wage jobs for our neighbors and our clients. But at the same time, again, it's another strategy to engage business and partnership to be able to bring in economic opportunities for the East Side.
Will that
Lastly,
be a for-profit entity?
Oh, go ahead, Adam.
Will that be a for-profit?
Yeah, it will be. So it is. So cool structure. Again, this would be maybe another longer call, but we spent a long time researching and then developing and launching a structure where the 501c3 nonprofit Reconciliation Services wholly owns RS Social Ventures C Corp that then has a disregarded LLC up front. And that structure allows us to have a mission-driven, purpose-driven company where all of the profit actually is inured back to the C3. And there are reasons why we chose to do it not as a nonprofit. And there's kind of a decision tree that went to that.
I fully support it. I love the idea that it's for profit. So
awesome. And we're also launching, we're in the middle right now of an $11 million campaign to revitalize and to rejuvenate this last corner of 31st and Truist. Operation Breakthrough's done an incredible job across the street. Looks like Millhouse and KCATA are going to do the other side. And so I need partners right now. So that big project, that big multi-million-dollar project is revitalizing the building, expanding our work, bringing in a partner that's a for-profit mission-aligned partner to our 4th floor to co-locate with us, and then also to capitalize the for-profit work that Reconciliation Social Ventures is doing. So I need help with that. I need help meeting people who want to contribute to that. Very briefly, it's a cool structure. There's a charitable component to that. There's a new market tax credit component to that. And then there's a social impact investment fund that's a component of that. So if anybody's interested, just hit me up on LinkedIn or afterwards. Adam says yes. Awesome. Randy told me you might be interested in that, Adam.
Yeah. How much commonality have you seen with the way you work with folks and trauma, and are there ways to build alliances with some of these like-minded organizations and accomplish even more work?
Yeah, like I said earlier, Randy, we can't do what we do alone. We have partnerships with the library, with Community Veterans Project, Hope Faith, the Rescue Mission, Restart, Journey to New Life, Literacy KC, Operation Breakthrough, Truman Medical. I mean, the list is really long of people that we have formal partnerships with. And so I think that most people look at trauma who work in this world, kind of like Frank was talking about. When you've worked in the world, you recognize the importance of addressing trauma and economic opportunities. So we've carved out our particular place. You know, if homeless ministry or homeless work are working with folks that are kind of in the mud below the ladder, not even on the economic ladder, and if Move It Forward kind of mentoring and education work is sort of second rung of the ladder, we're working with that first rung of the ladder, who Dr. King famously said in his speech that many of the community are chained to the first rung of the economic ladder in our society. And so we've worked really hard to carve out a niche that doesn't duplicate, but partners with both sides of that.
You mentioned some of the ways we can contribute, father, and volunteer. Are there other, I mean, you have some other suggestions? As soon as I sent that question to Randy, you started addressing the question.
Yeah. So a couple ways you can plug in. Number one, you can give. Of course, what we do is fueled still by and large, not by the earned revenue strategies, although that's a big goal, but it's still fueled by individual charitable and philanthropic giving for people who want to help us advance this mission. So you can go to Reconciliation Services website or thelmaskitchen.org and you can contribute. The second thing is you can go to thelmaskitchen.org and you can sign up to volunteer. You can come down here. We have a very COVID-safe volunteer environment. We've taken great measures to make sure that our clients, staff, neighbors, and volunteers are safe. You can read more about that on the thelmaskitchen.org website. You can buy lunch. I call it slacktivism. You know, just by buying Thelma's box lunch, go to thelmasboxlunch.org. Next time you're having a big meeting or you want to buy a lunch, you can either pick it up here at the window or with a big meeting, just like we did for Partners in Primary Care on Tuesday. We delivered 85 box lunches to 6 locations for them. We're a 5-star Yelp rated restaurant on Troost.
Wow.
And so the food is really, really good.
That's a great idea.
Yeah, so we're coming after Panera and Jersey Subs and all those guys. So with every single box lunch that you buy, all of the proceeds go to fuel the work that we're doing here on Troost. So just be a slacktivist, a slacker activist. You can also bring your company down to partner with us through the Lunch on EKC program. And then if you're really sold and you want to help us, we need help with that larger capital campaign and job creation campaign on Troost. So lots of ways to plug in at lots of different levels. Go to our websites and you can figure out where to start and we'd begin. We'd love to work with you. We'd be honored. By the way, maybe there's a way we can help you guys too. I spend a lot of time at companies addressing DE&I issues or coming to help brainstorm with CEOs and leaders on how to actualize and operationalize their DE&I aspirations and kind of move beyond the charity checkbox. So maybe there's a way that I can help you guys too. Thank you, Randy. Thank you, everybody, for the questions and your attention. You know, Simone Weil, great French philosopher, said that attention is the greatest form of generosity. So I really, truly, sincerely appreciate your generosity and your support. And Randy, thank you for having me on the program. I hope it is efficacious in some way.